Marcus Chen adjusted his dress uniform one last time before stepping out of the transport pod. The fabric felt strange after years of wearing casual civilian clothes. The metals clinked softly against his chest as he walked toward the gleaming spire of the Galactic Academy. Tonight was his twins' graduation gala, and despite his reluctance to attend such formal events, nothing would keep him from being there for Sarah and David. The Academy's main hall buzzed with excitement as hundreds of species mingled together. Tall, elegant Altarians with their crystalline skin chatted with the bear-like Ursans. Delicate Zephyrians floated gracefully between groups, their translucent wings catching the light. Marcus felt like a relic among all these young, bright faces representing the future of galactic cooperation. He spotted his twins across the room, both wearing the pristine white uniforms of Academy graduates. Sarah was deep in conversation with a group of Centauri delegates, her animated gestures making her look just like her mother had at that age. David stood nearby, his quiet confidence drawing admirers from several species. Pride swelled in Marcus's chest. They had grown into remarkable young adults during their 4 years at the Academy. "Dad!" Sarah's voice cut through the crowd as she spotted him. She rushed over, her graduation pins gleaming on her collar. "You made it. I wasn't sure you'd come with all the formal protocols and everything." Marcus smiled, pulling his daughter into a gentle hug. "Wouldn't miss it for anything, sweetheart. You look incredible." David joined them, his handshake firm and confident. "Thanks for being here, Dad. It means everything to us." "So, what's the program for tonight?" Marcus asked, trying to navigate the sea of alien dignitaries and Academy officials. "First, there's the recognition ceremony," Sarah explained excitedly. "Then dinner, followed by the commissioning speeches. Oh, and Dad, there are some really important people here tonight. Admiral Vextar from the Hegemony Fleet is giving the keynote address." Marcus nodded, though the name meant little to him. He had been out of military circles for 15 years, focusing instead on his small engineering firm on Earth's moon colonies. The political landscape of the galaxy had shifted dramatically since his service days. As they moved through the crowd, Marcus noticed how other attendees glanced at his uniform. Some looked curious, others respectful, but a few seemed genuinely surprised. He supposed seeing an older human veteran at such an event was unusual. Most of his generation had either moved into civilian life completely or taken positions far from the public eye. The recognition ceremony began with Academy Commandant Zarthul taking the stage. The Vorthan leader's forearms gestured gracefully as she welcomed the gathered families and dignitaries. Marcus listened politely as she spoke about the graduating class's achievements and their bright futures serving galactic peace. "This year's class is particularly special," Commandant Zarthul continued. "They have trained during a time of unprecedented cooperation between our worlds. The lessons learned from past conflicts have shaped them into leaders who understand both the cost of war and the value of peace." Marcus's mind wandered slightly during the formal speeches. He remembered his own graduation from Earth's military academy decades ago. The ceremony had been smaller, more militaristic, focused entirely on Earth's defense needs. How different the galaxy had become since then. A commotion near the entrance caught his attention. Several Academy security officers were escorting a group of high-ranking military officials into the hall. At their center walked a figure that made Marcus's blood run cold. Admiral Kethvar of the Zephyrian Imperial Fleet, his distinctive purple uniform, unmistakable even across the crowded room. Marcus had hoped never to see that particular alien again. Their last encounter had been during the ceasefire negotiations 15 years ago, and it hadn't ended pleasantly. Kethvar had accused human forces of unnecessary brutality during the final campaign of the border wars. Marcus had responded with some choice words about Zephyrian tactics that nearly derailed the entire peace process. "Dad, you okay?" David's voice brought him back to the present. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just old memories," Marcus replied, forcing a smile. "Nothing important." The ceremony continued with individual recognitions for outstanding cadets. Both Sarah and David were called forward for academic excellence, making Marcus beam with pride despite his discomfort at being in such a public venue. As they returned to their seats, he noticed Admiral Kethvar's gaze sweep across the room and pause momentarily when it reached him. Recognition flickered in the alien's large, compound eyes. Marcus straightened instinctively. Old military habits taking over. He might be retired, but he wouldn't show weakness in front of a former enemy, especially not at his children's graduation. The dinner portion of the evening proved more relaxed. Marcus found himself seated at a table with other human families, along with a few alien dignitaries who seemed genuinely interested in making conversation. A Kelteron trade representative named Moltek shared fascinating stories about his species' merchant fleets, while a young Alteran diplomat asked thoughtful questions about Earth's recovery after the border wars. Mr. Chen, the Alteran, whose name was something unpronounceable that she'd shortened to Crystal, leaned forward with obvious curiosity. Your children mentioned you served during the border wars. That must have been an incredibly difficult time. Marcus chose his words carefully. It was a complicated conflict. A lot of good people on all sides paid the price for political failures. The histories we studied at the Academy painted it as humanity's introduction to galactic warfare, Crystal continued. They say human tactics were unconventional. We did what was necessary to protect our worlds, Marcus replied diplomatically. Every species brings their own strengths to conflict. Humans are particularly good at adapting under pressure. Sarah jumped in to change the subject. Dad's being modest. He won the Solar Cross for his actions during the siege of Kepler Station. The citation said he held off an entire hegemony battle group with just 3 damaged frigates. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. That's enough, Sarah. Let's focus on your achievements tonight. Not old war stories, but the damage was done. Several conversations around their table had quieted, and Marcus could feel eyes turning toward him with new interest. Word spread quickly in such gatherings, and within minutes he noticed whispers following him wherever he moved. The situation became more uncomfortable when Commandant Zarthul approached their table during the social hour between dinner and the evening's final speeches. Colonel Chen, she said formally, using his old rank. I had hoped to speak with you this evening. Your reputation precedes you, even here at the Academy. I'm retired, Commandant, Marcus replied, standing out of respect for her position. Just a proud father tonight. Dubio. CA. Of course. She smiled, though her expression remained serious. However, I wonder if you might spare a few minutes for a private conversation. There are some current situations that could benefit from your unique perspective. Marcus glanced at his twins, who were watching the exchange with obvious curiosity. I'd prefer to keep this evening focused on the graduates. If you don't mind. I understand completely, Zarthul nodded. Perhaps after the ceremony concludes? It concerns some recent developments in the outer systems that have military leaders concerned. Before Marcus could respond, a new voice cut through their conversation. Colonel Marcus Chen, of the Terran Defense Forces. The voice was unmistakably Zephyrian, with its characteristic harmonic undertones. Marcus turned to see Admiral Kethvar approaching, flanked by 2 junior officers. The purple-skinned alien moved with the fluid grace typical of his species. But Marcus could read tension in his posture. Admiral, Marcus replied neutrally. It's been a long time. Indeed it has. Kethvar's large eyes studied Marcus carefully. I must admit, I'm surprised to find you here. The last I heard, you had withdrawn completely from military affairs. My children are graduating tonight, Marcus explained simply. I'm here as their father, nothing more. Kethvar's gaze moved to Sarah and David, who had risen from their seats and stood slightly behind their father. Ah, yes. The Chen twins have exceptional records. Your daughter's tactical analyses in particular show remarkable insight for one so young. There was something in the Admiral's tone that made Marcus wary. During their previous encounters, Kethvar had never shown interest in small talk. The Zephyrian was building up to something. They've worked very hard, Marcus said carefully. I'm proud of what they've accomplished here. As you should be. Kethvar nodded. Tell me, Colonel, do they know about the hegemony incident? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Sarah and David looked confused, but Commandant Zarthul's expression showed she understood exactly what Kethvar was referencing. The hegemony incident was classified at the highest levels, known only to senior military leadership from the species directly involved. Admiral, Marcus's voice carried a warning. That's not appropriate dinner conversation. Perhaps not, Kethvar agreed, but recent intelligence suggests it may become very relevant again. The hegemony has been making inquiries about those events. Specifically, they've been asking questions about the human officer who was present when their battle fleet mysteriously suffered total system failures. Marcus felt the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Around their small group, other conversations continued normally. But he could sense that something significant was happening beneath the surface of this seemingly casual encounter. I think this conversation should continue in private. Commandant Zarthul interjected smoothly. Perhaps we could use my office after the evening's festivities conclude? Kethvar's wing-like appendages fluttered slightly. A gesture Marcus remembered indicated amusement in Zephyrian body language. Of course, Commandant, but I believe Colonel Chen should know that his presence here tonight has already been noted by several intelligence services. His distinctive service record makes him a person of interest even in retirement. Marcus looked at his children, seeing confusion and growing concern in their faces. This was supposed to be their night, their moment of triumph and celebration. Now, it was being overshadowed by ghosts from his past that he'd hoped would stay buried. Dad, Sarah spoke quietly. What's the hegemony incident? Before Marcus could answer, the lights in the hall dimmed slightly, signaling that the evening's final ceremony was about to begin. Admiral Kethvar stepped back gracefully. We should take our seats, he said formally. The keynote address is about to commence. I believe you'll find tonight's speaker quite enlightening. Colonel Chen. As the alien dignitaries moved away, Marcus remained standing for a moment, his mind racing. The keynote speaker was supposed to be Admiral Vextar from the Hegemony Fleet. The same hegemony that Kethvar had just mentioned was asking questions about classified events from the border wars. Dad, what's going on? David asked quietly, as they moved toward the auditorium section of the hall. Marcus put his arms around both his children's shoulders. Probably nothing important, son. Just old military politics. Tonight is about you two and your achievements. Don't let anything else distract from that. But even as he spoke the words, Marcus knew the evening had taken a turn that would change everything. The past he'd tried so hard to leave behind was catching up with him. And worse, it was threatening to involve his children in ways he'd never intended. As they found their seats for the keynote address, Marcus noticed several alien officials positioning themselves strategically around the auditorium. Security was heavier than normal for an academy graduation, and the attention seemed focused on their section of the seating area. The lights dimmed further, and a spotlight illuminated the stage as academy protocol officers announced the evening's keynote speaker. Marcus straightened in his seat, preparing himself for what he suspected would be far more than a simple graduation address. The events of 15 years ago were about to catch up with him, whether he wanted them to or not. Admiral Vextar emerged from the wings of the auditorium stage with the measured pace of a career military officer. The Hegemony Admiral was impressive even by alien standards, standing nearly 8 feet tall with the characteristic scaled hide and pronounced cranial ridges of his species. His dress uniform was immaculate, adorned with medals and ribbons that spoke of decades of distinguished service. Marcus felt his chest tighten as he watched the alien take the podium. The last time he'd seen Vextar had been during the aftermath of the Kepler Station siege, when the Hegemony Admiral had demanded explanations for what he called impossible tactical outcomes. Marcus had been too busy dealing with casualties and damage reports to provide satisfactory answers at the time. Honored graduates, distinguished faculty, and esteemed guests, Vextar began, his voice carrying easily through the hall's acoustics. It is my privilege to address this remarkable gathering tonight. The Academy has long been a symbol of cooperation between our various civilizations, proof that former enemies can become allies, and that knowledge can bridge any gap between species. The speech started conventionally enough, touching on themes of unity, progress, and shared destiny among the galactic community. Marcus tried to relax, telling himself that his paranoia was getting the better of him. This was simply a graduation ceremony, nothing more. The graduates before us represent hope, Vextar continued. They have studied the lessons of our collective history, learning not just from our successes but from our failures. They understand that true strength comes not from military might alone, but from the wisdom to know when and how to use it. Sarah leaned over to whisper to her father. He's actually quite eloquent. The hegemony has a reputation for being rather blunt in their communications. Marcus nodded absently, but his attention was focused on the subtle changes in Vextar's delivery. The Admiral's gaze had begun sweeping the audience more deliberately, and there was a growing intensity in his voice that suggested the speech was building toward something specific. During my own career, Vextar said, I have had the privilege of serving alongside warriors from many species. Each brought their own unique strengths to our common cause. The Altarians brought their technological precision, the Zephyrians contributed their strategic brilliance, the Ursans provided their unwavering courage. The Admiral paused, his large, dark eyes scanning the audience until they found Marcus's section. And humans. Humans brought something that still amazes me to this day. They brought the ability to achieve the impossible when everything seemed lost. Marcus felt every muscle in his body tense. Around him, other audience members were nodding politely at what seemed like diplomatic praise for human contributions to galactic security. But Marcus could hear something else in the Admiral's tone. A specificity that suggested this wasn't generic flattery. 15 years ago, Vextar continued, I learned a lesson about human nature that has stayed with me throughout my career. It was during the final campaign of the Border Wars, at a remote station that most of you have probably never heard of. The tactical situation was hopeless. 3 damaged human vessels faced an entire battle group of my own fleet. Marcus's blood ran cold. David and Sarah both turned to look at their father. Recognition dawning in their faces as they connected the Admiral's words to the earlier conversations about their father's service record. By every military calculation, by every strategic analysis, by every computer simulation we could run, the outcome was predetermined, Vextar said, his voice growing stronger. The human ships were outgunned, outnumbered, and operating with critical system failures. Logic dictated immediate surrender or retreat. The auditorium had grown completely silent. Even the youngest cadets seemed to sense that this was no longer a standard graduation address. This was something far more significant. But the human commander made a different choice, Vextar continued. He chose to fight. Not with conventional tactics, not with superior firepower, but with something that our military academies had never taught us to quantify. He fought with pure, stubborn, unreasonable human determination. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, memories flooding back. The bridge of the UES Defiance, alarms blaring as system after system failed. Lieutenant Rodriguez calling out damage reports while Ensign Park tried desperately to keep weapons online. The impossible decision to turn their dying ships directly into the path of an entire enemy fleet. I watched that day as 3 human vessels did something that should have been impossible, Vextar said. They not only held their position, they turned a hopeless defensive action into a tactical victory that forced my entire fleet to withdraw. How? By refusing to accept that defeat was inevitable. The Admiral's gaze found Marcus directly now, and there was no mistaking the intention. The human commander that day taught me that there are forces in this universe more powerful than superior numbers or advanced technology. Sometimes, the simple refusal to give up can change the course of history. Sarah reached over and gripped her father's hand tightly. David sat straighter in his chair, his expression a mixture of pride and amazement as he began to understand the magnitude of what he was hearing. That commander's actions didn't just save Kepler Station, Vextar continued. They demonstrated to the entire hegemony fleet that humans were not the primitive, easily defeated species we had assumed them to be. That single engagement changed our entire approach to the war and ultimately led to the peace negotiations that ended the conflict. Marcus wanted to sink into his chair and disappear. Every eye in the auditorium seemed to be turning toward their section, as audience members began to make connections between the Admiral's story and the retired human officer sitting among them. I mention this tonight, Vextar said, not to relitigate old conflicts, but to illustrate a point about courage. True courage isn't the absence of fear. It's not having superior firepower or perfect intelligence. True courage is making the right choice when every logical analysis tells you that choice will lead to failure. The Admiral paused, taking a sip of water before continuing. The graduates before us tonight will face challenges we cannot imagine. They will encounter situations where their training, their technology, and their allies may not be enough. In those moments, I hope they will remember that sometimes the most powerful weapon in the galaxy is the simple determination to do what's right, regardless of the odds. As Vextar spoke, Marcus noticed movement in the audience. Several alien officials were quietly repositioning themselves, and there seemed to be an unusual number of security personnel stationed around the exits. Whatever was happening here was clearly more than a spontaneous recognition during a graduation speech. The galaxy has changed significantly since the border wars, Vextar continued. We have built alliances where once there were only enemies. We have created institutions like this academy, where young beings from dozens of species learn together. We have achieved a level of cooperation that seemed impossible 2 decades ago. The Admiral's tone grew more serious. But peace is not a permanent condition. It is something that must be earned every day, protected by those willing to make difficult choices. Recent intelligence reports suggest that not all factions in our galaxy are content with the current state of affairs. There are those who view the cooperation between species as weakness rather than strength. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. This was beginning to sound less like a graduation address and more like a briefing on current threats. He glanced around and saw that several Academy faculty members looked as surprised as he felt by the direction of the speech. The hegemony has recently discovered evidence of coordinated activities by extremist factions from multiple species, Vextar announced. These groups seek to destabilize the peace we have worked so hard to achieve. They believe that conflict and separation are the natural states of galactic civilization. The auditorium buzzed with quiet conversation as the implications of this revelation sank in. This was clearly news to most of the audience, including many of the faculty and administrative officials. In response to these threats, Vextar continued. The major galactic powers have agreed to establish a joint task force. This force will require leadership with experience in unconventional warfare, individuals who understand both the cost of conflict and the value of peace. Marcus suddenly understood where this was heading. The entire evening, from Admiral Kethvar's pointed questions to Commandant Zarathul's request for a private meeting, had been building toward this moment. They weren't just recognizing his past service. They were recruiting him for something new. Tonight, I have the honor of announcing that Colonel Marcus Chen of the Terran Defense Forces has agreed to come out of retirement to lead this joint task force. The words hit the auditorium like a thunderbolt. Marcus felt his heart stop as hundreds of eyes turned toward him. Sarah and David both stared at their father in shock, while the other audience members burst into surprised applause. Wait, Marcus said, starting to rise from his seat. I never agreed to, but Admiral Vextar was already continuing his announcement. Colonel Chen's unique experience with multi-species operations and his proven ability to achieve victory against overwhelming odds make him the ideal choice for this critical mission. Marcus found himself standing in the spotlight that had suddenly illuminated their section of the auditorium. The applause was thunderous, but all he could think about was how this was supposed to be his children's night, and now it was being completely overshadowed by military politics. Admiral, Marcus called out, his voice carrying clearly in the acoustics of the hall. With all due respect, this is neither the time nor the place for such announcements. Tonight should be about the graduates. Vextar nodded graciously. You are absolutely correct, Colonel. Please, allow me to properly honor tonight's graduates before we discuss operational matters. The Admiral smoothly transitioned back to more traditional graduation remarks, but the damage was done. The entire character of the evening had changed. Marcus remained standing, uncertain whether to leave, stay, or demand an immediate explanation. Sarah tugged on his sleeve. Dad, sit down. Everyone's staring. They're staring because apparently I've just been volunteered for something I know nothing about, Marcus whispered back as he reluctantly took his seat. But you're considering it, aren't you? David said quietly. I can see it in your expression. You're already thinking about whatever threat he mentioned. Marcus looked at his son sharply, then realized David was right. Despite his anger at the way this had been handled, his mind was already working through the implications of Vextar's briefing. Extremist factions, destabilization efforts, the need for unconventional warfare expertise. It painted a picture of emerging threats that could endanger everything the peace accords had achieved. As Vextar concluded his address and the formal ceremony wound down, Marcus found himself surrounded by well-wishers and curious onlookers. Academy officials, alien dignitaries, and fellow human families all wanted to congratulate him or ask questions about his new assignment. "There is no new assignment," he told each group firmly. "I was not consulted about this announcement." But even as he spoke the words, Marcus could see the expressions of respect and expectation in the faces around him. The galaxy's military leadership clearly believed he was the right person for whatever this mission entailed. The weight of that expectation was both flattering and terrifying. Commandant Zarthul approached as the crowd began to thin. "Colonel Chen, I believe we need that private conversation now. Admiral Vex's Tar and several other senior officers are waiting in my conference room." Marcus looked at his twins, who were still trying to process everything that had happened. "This is supposed to be your celebration. I'm not leaving you to deal with military politics." "Dad," Sarah said firmly. "Go. We're not children anymore. We can handle ourselves at a party. Besides, I think you need to find out exactly what you've been volunteered for." David nodded in agreement. "And based on what the Admiral said, it sounds like this might be important for everyone in the galaxy. Not just you." Marcus felt a surge of pride at his children's maturity, even as he worried about what he was about to walk into. The retired officer in him knew that spontaneous recruitment announcements at public events were highly unusual, which meant either this was a desperate situation, or there were political factors he didn't understand. As he followed Commandant Zarthul toward the administrative section of the academy, Marcus caught sight of Admiral Kethvar watching from across the room. The Zephyrian's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his posture that suggested satisfaction, as if events were proceeding according to some larger plan. The evening that was supposed to be about celebrating his children's achievements had become something entirely different. Marcus was about to learn whether he was walking into an opportunity to serve the greater good or if he was being manipulated by forces he didn't yet understand. Either way, his quiet retirement was clearly over. The conference room, adjacent to Commandant Zarthul's office, was surprisingly crowded when Marcus entered. Admiral Vextar sat at the head of the polished table, flanked by Admiral Kethvar and 3 other senior officers Marcus didn't recognize. The mix of species represented suggested this was indeed a joint operation of significant scope. "Colonel Chen, thank you for joining us," Vextar said as Marcus took the indicated seat across from the assembled officers. "I apologize for the dramatic nature of tonight's announcement, but circumstances have forced our hand." "Before we discuss any circumstances," Marcus replied firmly, "I want to make something clear. I never agreed to lead any task force. In fact, I wasn't even aware such a position existed. Until 5 minutes ago, a thin, almost skeletal alien, whom Marcus didn't recognize, leaned forward. "Forgive me, Colonel, but perhaps introductions are in order. I am Intelligence Director Tixal of the Centauri Republic. Admiral Kethvar and Admiral Vextar serve as military liaisons for this operation, while Commandant Zarthul represents the Academy's interests in training and logistics." "And what exactly is this operation?" Marcus asked. Director Tixal activated a holographic display in the center of the table. 3 weeks ago, our intelligence networks detected coordinated movements by extremist factions across 17 different star systems. These groups represent at least 6 different species, including some humans, and they appear to be organizing for a large-scale action. The holographic display showed star charts with highlighted systems and movement patterns. Marcus studied them with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years analyzing threat assessments. "Their objectives remain unclear," Admiral Kethvar added, "but their activities suggest preparation for either a series of simultaneous strikes against key installations or an attempt to provoke renewed conflict between major galactic powers." Marcus absorbed this information while noting what wasn't being said. "That's a fairly standard intelligence briefing on emerging threats. Why does it require pulling a retired officer out of civilian life with a public announcement at his children's graduation? Admiral Vextar exchanged glances with the other officers before responding. Because our analysis indicates these groups have specific knowledge of classified military operations from the border wars. Knowledge that should have been restricted to the highest levels of command. The hegemony incident, Marcus said quietly. Among others, Director Thixall confirmed, but that particular event seems to be central to their planning. Our intercepted communications suggest they believe human tactical capabilities were artificially enhanced during that engagement. Marcus felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Artificially enhanced how? They seemed to think humans had access to alien technology that allowed 3 damaged ships to disable an entire battle fleet, Vextar explained. Technology that was never reported or shared with galactic authorities. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Marcus looked around the table, seeing a mixture of curiosity and suspicion in the alien faces watching him. "You think I had some kind of secret weapon," Marcus said finally. "We know you didn't," Commandant Zarthal interjected quickly. Every piece of human equipment from that engagement was thoroughly analyzed afterward. There were no technological anomalies, no unexplained capabilities. But the extremist groups don't know that, Admiral Kethvar continued. They believe human forces were holding back advanced capabilities during the war, and they're convinced that those capabilities represent a threat to galactic stability. HPI. Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing the absurdity of the situation. So they're planning some kind of action based on a completely false premise about technologies that don't exist. False premises have started larger wars than the border conflicts, Director Thixall observed grimly. The truth is often less important than what people choose to believe. And that brings us to why we need you specifically, Admiral Vextar said. These groups are convinced that the hegemony incident represents proof of hidden human military capabilities. They're planning to force Earth to reveal these supposed secret weapons by creating a crisis that would require their use. A crisis like what? Marcus asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. Simultaneous attacks on human colonies and allied installations, timed to overwhelm conventional defensive capabilities, Admiral Kethvar explained. They believe that if humans face total defeat, Earth will be forced to deploy whatever secret technologies they think allowed 3 ships to defeat an entire fleet. Marcus rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building. And when Earth doesn't deploy any secret weapons because they don't exist? Then the extremists will claim humans are willing to let innocent people die to protect their technological advantages, Director Thixall said. It would shatter the trust that forms the foundation of our current alliance structure. The tactical implications were staggering. Marcus could see how such a scenario would play out across the galactic community. Species that had spent decades building cooperative relationships would begin viewing each other with suspicion. Trade agreements would collapse, defensive alliances would fracture, and the entire peace structure could crumble within months. "You want me to lead a task force to prevent this," Marcus said. "We want you to do what you did 15 years ago," Admiral Vextar replied. "Achieve the impossible." "What I did 15 years ago was get lucky," Marcus protested. 3 desperate ships with nothing to lose took a wild gamble that happened to work. That's not a repeatable strategy. Admiral Kethvar spoke for the first time since the briefing began. "Colonel, may I ask you a direct question?" Marcus nodded. "During the hegemony incident, what was your actual tactical objective when you turned your ships toward my fleet?" Marcus thought back to that desperate moment on the bridge of the Defiance. Survival. Pure and simple. We couldn't outrun your ships. We couldn't fight them conventionally. So we tried to get close enough to make you worry about collateral damage to your own vessels. And when that didn't work, when we maintained formation and prepared to destroy your ships at point-blank range, Marcus remembered the moment vividly. The enemy ships had held their positions, calling his bluff. His own vessels were seconds away from destruction, and he had made one last, desperate decision. "I ordered all ships to dump their reactor cores simultaneously," Marcus said quietly. "Not to detonate them, just to dump the raw plasma. I figured if we were going to die anyway, We might as well create enough electromagnetic interference to disrupt your targeting systems for a few seconds. And that electromagnetic pulse, Admiral Vextar said slowly, interacted with our fleet's experimental sensor array in a way that cascaded through our entire network, causing temporary system failures across all vessels. Marcus stared at the Admiral. Experimental sensor array? A new technology we were testing, Vextar confirmed. It linked all ships in the fleet through a quantum entanglement network, allowing instantaneous communication and coordination. We thought it would give us an overwhelming tactical advantage, but it also meant that when your plasma dump interfered with the quantum field generators, Admiral Kethvar continued, the disruption affected every ship simultaneously. Your desperate attempt to buy a few seconds of confusion disabled our entire fleet. Marcus felt the pieces clicking together. So it wasn't human determination or tactical brilliance. It was a complete accident that exploited a vulnerability you hadn't made public. The extremist groups don't know about the sensor array, Director Thicksall explained. That technology was classified and eventually abandoned as too risky. From their perspective, 3 human ships somehow disabled 30 hegemony vessels through means they can't explain. Which brings us back to the current crisis, Commandant Zarthul said. We need someone who understands both the reality of what happened that day and the psychology of beings desperate enough to stake everything on an impossible plan. Marcus looked around the table again, seeing the weight of expectation in every face. And you think that person is me? We think you're the only person in the galaxy who has actually pulled victory from the jaws of certain defeat through pure improvisation, Admiral Vextar said. That's exactly the kind of thinking we'll need to counter these extremist groups. The silence stretched for several moments as Marcus considered the proposal. He thought about his quiet life on Luna, his engineering firm, the simple pleasure of building things instead of destroying them. Then he thought about Sarah and David, and the future they deserved to inherit. What exactly would this task force be authorized to do? He asked finally. Whatever is necessary to prevent galactic war, Director Thicksall replied. Full authority to operate across species boundaries, access to intelligence assets from all major powers, and military support as needed. No oversight? No political constraints? The Oversight Committee consists of the beings in this room, Admiral Kethvar said. Beyond that, operational decisions would be entirely yours. Marcus stood and walked to the room's viewport, looking out at the stars beyond the Academy. Somewhere, out there, extremist factions were preparing for actions that could destroy everything the galaxy had built since the border wars. And apparently, he was the only person they thought capable of stopping it. I have conditions, he said finally. Name them, Admiral Vextar replied immediately. First, my children are not to be involved in any way. They continue their careers without interference or special treatment related to my activities. Agreed. Second, if I determine that this threat is being exaggerated for political purposes, I walk away immediately. Understood. Third, I want complete access to all intelligence related to these extremist groups, including information about their human members. Director Thicksall hesitated slightly. Some of that intelligence is quite sensitive. Then you'll have to decide whether stopping this crisis is worth sharing sensitive information. Marcus said bluntly. Agreed, Admiral Vextar said quickly. Anything else? Marcus turned back to face the assembled officers. I want to know why you really chose to announce this publicly tonight. A mission this sensitive would normally be handled through completely confidential channels. The aliens exchanged glances before Admiral Kethvar answered. Because the extremist groups have intelligence assets too. They needed to see that we were taking their threats seriously enough to bring the hero of Kepler Station out of retirement. You're using me as bait. We're using you as a symbol, Commandant Zarthul corrected. Your presence leading this task force will either deter them from their planned action or force them to accelerate their timeline before they're fully prepared. Marcus almost smiled despite the gravity of the situation. So we're back to desperate gambits and impossible odds. It seems to be what humans excel at, Admiral Vextar observed, with something that might have been humor. All right, Marcus said after a long moment. I'll take the assignment. But I want one more thing. Yes? I want to be the one to tell my children what their father has gotten himself into. As Marcus headed back toward the main hall to find Sarah and David, he realized that his quiet retirement was truly over. In the span of a single evening, he had gone from proud parent attending a graduation to leader of a classified task force responsible for preventing galactic war. When he entered the main hall, he found his twins surrounded by other graduates and their families, all eager to meet the children of the famous Colonel Chen. Sarah spotted him immediately and rushed over. "Dad, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," Marcus replied, pulling both his children aside. "But definitely some complications I wasn't expecting." As he explained the situation to Sarah and David, Marcus watched their expressions shift from confusion to amazement to concern and finally to pride. They were definitely their father's children, he realized, with a mixture of joy and worry. "So when do you start?" David asked practically. "Tomorrow, probably," Marcus admitted. "This threat is apparently more immediate than I'd hoped." "Then tonight is still ours," Sarah declared firmly. "Whatever happens tomorrow, tonight, you're still just our dad, celebrating our graduation." Marcus smiled, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. "You're absolutely right. Tonight, we celebrate." But even as he rejoined the festivities, Marcus knew that everything had changed. The man who had stumbled into heroism 15 years ago, through luck and desperation, was about to face an even greater challenge. This time, the fate of galactic civilization might literally rest in his hands. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that the extremist groups knew exactly how to manipulate the situation to their advantage. After all, they had been studying his tactics for 15 years, while he was just now learning they existed. The game was about to begin, and Marcus wasn't entirely sure he understood the rules.